this is going to be a very interesting union budget because it comes at a time when the world economy is in a flux. There are fears of a recession globally, and India seems to be the bright spark. But how do you ensure that we maximize that position? On the other hand, it's also the last full budget before the next general elections. So the questions are now abounding on whether this will be in some form a populist budget. Ahead of the union budget, I'm speaking today with Arvind Panagariya. He's of course the first vice chair of the Niti Aayog and also professor at Columbia University. Mr. Panagariya, thank you so much for speaking with us. Always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Very happy to be with you, Tamanna.
So let's begin with sort of the context that I set up. What will be the boxes to tick off in this union budget for the finance minister? And do you think the upcoming election in 2024 will be somewhere on the horizon at all in the back of her mind?
I mean, as you just said, this is the last full budget before the elections. So I imagine that, it will play some role, but I don't think it will play a big role. Because, ultimately there will be the interim budget before the elections, and if the government really feels that it needs to play up a bit the populism, it still has that opportunity in the interim budget. So that's one fact, and the other fact is that, this government has generally been responsible in terms of even when adopting, populist schemes. These are schemes which do actually bring in assured benefits to whoever the intended beneficiary is. So even if some of it is done, it will take a form which would have real impact rather than simply wasting the money.
Yeah.
So that's one, and then we can talk about what else the budget could try to do.
Absolutely, we'll definitely get into it, but I just want to set the stage a little bit. That is a big domestic consideration, right? The next election and whether that will play out or not. What is the form that populism will take, if at all? That is one part of it. The second part of it is sort of cementing India's position as a nation that will do relatively well. And here the word relative is key. Do you think that the budget is a vehicle to sort of set the stage for that?
It certainly is, because budget is a source of signaling. So what it says, how it says, is also going to matter. Now because of this being the last full budget, it may not carry very many bold reforms, but still the signal has to be there. So as an example, I'll give you, and then we can talk more. As an example, there should be something, stating about the government's continued intent to privatize the public sector enterprises, the public sector banks, monetization of assets. So, even things that are ongoing, which really are not new reforms, but some reiteration would be a useful thing. And especially, we are at a time when multinationals are looking for China plus one strategy. And so, they are comparing us to some of the other potential competitors in that category of countries. So I think some of this sort of thing will have to be there.
Another big reform / populist move, depends on however you want to look at it. But one big expectation seems to have come from the middle class this time round on tax exemptions. And you have a very interesting view on it. You're saying that, okay, you can tinker with the tax slabs, but remove all the exemptions. I want you to first lay out your thought for this.
Yes. Okay. So that's one reform actually which can be announced in this budget, should be announced. It will be both popular and efficiency enhancing. So currently the way our system is, for most taxpayers, a large number of exemptions and then relatively high tax rates. So what these exemptions do is to introduce a kind of, inequity across taxpayers with the same income. So, if you have the same income that I have, but you are spending your income in such a way that you are able to make use of the exemptions. but I'm spending my income in a way that I can't make use of the exemptions, then I pay more taxes than you do. That I think is not only inequitable, but is also distortionary, because it in a way is encouraging people to spend money in a certain way rather than according to their own priorities. So a good tax system usually minimizes exemptions, and ideally really eliminates all of them, and keeps the tax rates low. Now, the government had tried this, in the budget 2020-21. It introduced an alternative tax schedule, which taxpayers could use. Largely, very few exemptions were actually admissible under that schedule, but the tax rates still remained quite high. As a result, there have not been very many takers. Only people like me, who have zero exemptions. So I certainly use that tax schedule myself. But everybody I've spoken to in my family and my wife's family and so forth, nobody is using it. So what we need to do, the spirit of the reform was correct, that have a tax schedule which eliminates the exemptions, but at the same time they bring down the tax rates. You can have 4 or 5, 6 tax rates. If there is some uncertainty, that with only 2 tax rates or 3 tax rates and no exemptions given somehow and lower tax rates, if there is fear that this is going to lead to reduced revenues, then the government could use 4 or 5 tax rates. Today, computers, the big effort of the taxpayer is in figuring out the exemptions today. So once you are done,
but Mr. Panagariya, if I may come to it, and I'll come to the new tax regime. We need to unpack that. But when you talk about exemptions and that sort of forcing you where to spend your money, now the idea always seemed to be to push taxpayers to spend their money virtuously. So, for example, all the exemptions on home loans did push the boom of that sector in India to some extent. Exemptions which are given for health insurance or for life insurance policies or towards some sort of savings or government bonds. The idea was always, or seems to be, to push expenditure in a virtuous path or a virtuous direction. Do you think there's no merit to that?
Well, look, what is the virtue here? You're trying to do good to me as the taxpayer. Well, allow me to judge. Why am I not be the best judge of what is good for me? How will the government know? Each of us has a different situation. The burden on the burden of disease may be different across families. The needs for savings may be different across families. Needs for housing may be different across families. Allow the taxpayer to make that decision. I think that is the point here. That what we are saying, the point you are making is that we got a state which knows better than me, the taxpayer, on what is good for me.
And I think, actually, sir, the virtue is not from the point of view of the taxpayer, but from where money is going and whether it's a good idea for the nation. So, for example, you give a boost to a sector or a certain kind of saving, and that seems to benefit the larger good or the greater good. That was the thought behind it, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, so I would like to be convinced that it is actually for the greater good. You can possibly make a case for example, giving the break on the interest payments on loans that you borrow for housing, because if you make the argument that investment in housing somehow is a major investment in anybody's life, and most families will in their lifetime will make that kind of investment and all, and that it boosts the economy, it boosts growth. Fair enough, so in 1 or 2 exceptions of that nature, fine, you can make the compromise. But I think to have so many of these exemptions, and face it, we are not talking about just the housing, the deduction of interest payments on your housing loans. but we are talking about tons of exemptions. The whole system is written with exemptions. Travel money, whether you spend on your meals, hotels, this, that. All kinds of deductions are there.
So,
I think, on balance, there is a lot of room to remove those exemptions.
so you spoke about the new tax regime and how, in your view and from the straw poll that you conducted around you, it's not very popular. That seems to be the general consensus. There's no final data, but the general consensus seems to be that the new tax regime hasn't really taken off. People haven't wanted to give up exemptions even for lower taxes. And the buzz is that the new tax regime may be sweetened, so they may add exemptions to it. Do you think that that's the only way to make it work? Because Indian taxpayers love their exemptions.
Well, then you don't need a reform, right? I mean, if that's the view you take. But I personally think that view has not been tested, simply because in the alternative that has been provided so far, the one in the 2020-21 budget, the tax rate was simply too high. I mean, I talked to my brother. He says that, well, and he's not, he's retired, lives on pension, or actually just interest income. And he said even for him, it was not worthwhile actually to use the alternative exemption-free alternative, which means that the tax rates without exemption were simply too high for anybody to take advantage. I mean, this is a case example I'm giving you. It's very middle class. Nothing, extraordinary at all. And yet, my brother chose the original route. So only, as I said, in my case, there's zero exemption. So find, some advantage to using.
So what would make the new tax regime essentially a tax system with no exemptions work and be palatable and fair? Let's be honest, the middle class taxpayer hasn't got a real break from the government for a while. So what would be, a fair sort of a proportion? How low would the taxes need to be to justify lopping off all the exemptions?
So look, it is not very difficult to figure out. I don't have all the data, but the government does. You take last year's tax payments. The government knows who took what exemptions, how much tax they paid, how much was their income. So from those data, it can be figured, if you were to take out exemptions, how far you can bring the tax rates down so that the tax revenue is still the same as before. And so it is something that can be figured out. Also, if the government, feels that there is some risk involved, then it can have multiple tax rates, 5 or 6 tax rates, depending on the income levels. And certainly, it can provide tax tables. Computers can calculate the taxes. Once exemptions are taken out, all the taxpayer has to figure out, the taxable income is more easily figured out, and then it's just in which tax bracket you fall, you'll get the tax rate. So I think it can be done, and until and unless the government once tries it, right, the option has to be given. Only then we will know whether people actually want exemptions or they don't. My hunch is that most people will actually come to begin using the new tax rates, so that it gives them greater freedom to use their own income in the way they want to use it. So I think it's a win-win kind of reform. The government doesn't have to lose revenue, and the taxpayer gets lower tax rates and gets to spend it the way the taxpayer wants.
The chatter and the populist talk is that the middle class, the salaried middle class, deserves a lower tax rate. Do you think the fiscal space for this exists right now? The target this year is 6.4%. The finance minister said we will hit it, and we're expecting a lowered target and lowered glide path going ahead. But do you think at this juncture, India really has the space to spend?
Well, I personally don't think that the government should give exemptions or lower tax rates so as to reduce its revenues. I think it needs to continue to have better and better tax collections, because otherwise you compromise for not a very good reason the fiscal consolidation objective. So that I would not encourage. I also feel that the government needs to keep up particularly the capital expenditure. This government has shown fantastic ability to build up infrastructure at speed and on scale. Practically, we have not seen this kind of rapid infrastructure build up with this efficiency. So I would like that to continue. So if we compromise on tax revenues, then all those other objectives will. Defense also needs a bit more expenditure. So the government really doesn't have that much room to allow revenues to fall. So this is why I say that if you actually do the personal income tax reform, you can satisfy the taxpayer because you will be lowering the tax rates. You will not lose your revenue, and efficiency actually of expenditures would improve. So I think all in all, this is a very win-win kind of reform.
What about the other sort of announcements you would like to see within the budget? There's a lot of talk that we may see an extension of the PLI scheme. Do you think there is enough data to suggest that the PLI scheme has actually achieved its goals? And should we be expanding the ambit of something like a production-linked incentive scheme?
Yeah, look, I've never been very persuaded on PLI scheme personally. I'm one of the few sort of economists who have been a little skeptical on this front, because you see, ultimately the goal has to be for manufacturing as a whole to flourish, and certainly PLI as well as protection can give you boost in certain sectors. Sectors that get the protection, sectors that get the subsidy will undoubtedly do better. Naturally, it improves the profitability for the entrepreneurs. So those sectors will do better. But the question is whether the manufacturing as a whole will do better. And that we have not seen. So manufacturing as a whole ultimately requires good policies, policies in which investors will flock to India, policies that would allow the new alternative supply chains to be built with India as its focus, as its hub. So for that, you need better policies ultimately, and how much subsidy can you give really ultimately, for the entrepreneur also 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, you can give subsidy, but ultimately the entrepreneur is going to have to survive without subsidy. So the sustainable kind of investment that we are looking for, and obviously, don't get me wrong, investors love it, and foreign multinationals also, when they come in, if they think, they want to come in anyway, and they can, in the process, get a few $100 million worth of subsidy, why not? So they would love it. They will never say that, no, this is of no use. But ultimately, to me, as an analyst, as an economist, really, subsidies are very, it's very hard to build up a whole wide manufacturing sector on the back of subsidies. In the end, good policies cannot be substituted by these either protection or subsidies.
Talking about protection, are we likely to see, in your view, more of those custom duty hikes? And this sort of surge of protectionism is now in vogue globally. In your view, should there be now a break on some of these?
Most certainly. In my view, actually, we need to not only have a break from it, but we also need to reverse some of what we have done. You see, look, the big tariff increases happened in 2018-19. And that happened in the context of a GST, which had not yet, begun to function well. Remember that the GST had been started implementing in July 2017, and initial revenue losses were large. So I think at that time, the then Finance Minister, Mr. Jaitley, consciously reversed several years, actually 2 decades of policy, and raised custom duties on about 40% of our tariff lines. Almost 40% items, experience increase in tariff duties in that year. So now, the GST is working well. Even the direct taxes have been functioning quite well, showing good buoyancy in the last 2 years. So given that fact, I think, the revenue goal of custom duties, which was to begin with was wrong. Custom duties are not supposed to be revenue instrument. They are instruments of protection, but not of revenue. But now that anyway the revenues are doing well, I think this is a time to begin rolling back at least those custom duties which were imposed particularly in 1819 with revenue as the objective.
Absolutely. Well, we'll wait and see what happens, and we hope to catch up with you again post the budget. Thank you so much, Mr. Panagariya, for joining us on the show.